And what is the amount of this debt? $823, Blackwood said reluctantly. The man reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew a handful of silver dollars and gold pieces, letting them fall onto the nearest table with metallic clinks that rang through the silence like bells. I have that amount. Morrison's eyes went wide at the sight of so much hard currency. In a frontier town where most business was conducted through barter and promissory notes, actual gold and silver were precious beyond measure. You want to bid? Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to buy, the man corrected. All of it. The debt, the woman, everything. Name your price. The crowd erupted into chaos. Voices rose in protest, chairs scraped against the floor, and more than one hand moved toward a gun. I pay the money, I take the woman, the debts are settled. Is this not how such transactions work? But you can't just... Blackwood sputtered, his carefully constructed worldview crashing down around him. She's a white woman, a Christian woman. You can't take her off to live with savages. The man's smile was cold as winter wind. Cannot by whose law? You were perfectly willing to sell her to any of these men, regardless of their intentions or character. What makes my coin less valuable than theirs? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Margaret realized with a shock that he was right. The men in this room had been prepared to purchase her services, her body, her labor, her complete subjugation without a moment's thought for her feelings or welfare. But the moment someone they considered an outsider showed interest, suddenly they were concerned about her well-being. The woman must consent, Dr. Harrison said quietly from the back of the room. He'd apparently arrived sometime during the confrontation, drawn perhaps by the commotion. Whatever the legal technicalities, she must have a choice in her own fate. All eyes turned to Margaret, and she felt the weight of that collective gaze like a physical burden. Here was her moment, the chance to choose her own destiny instead of having it chosen for her. She looked at Morrison, whose face was flushed with frustrated greed. She looked at Blackwood, whose self-righteous certainty had cracked to reveal the petty tyrant beneath. She looked at the crowd of men who'd come to bid on her like livestock, their faces showing everything from disappointed lust to outright rage. Then she looked at the stranger, the Comanche warrior who'd walked into hell itself to offer her a way out. His dark eyes met hers, and she saw something there that had been absent from every other face in the room: respect. He wasn't looking at her like she was broken goods or a problem to be solved. He was looking at her like she was a person capable of making her own decisions. What would you have me do? She asked him, her voice carrying clearly through the tense silence. He tilted his head slightly, considering the question. I would have you choose freely without fear or coercion. Come with me, and I will ask nothing of you but honesty. Stay here and... He gestured at the crowd around them. Well, you know what awaits you here. Margaret felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep inside her chest. Not the laugh of someone who found something funny, but the laugh of someone who had finally seen the cosmic joke that was her life. Here she was, a respectable white woman who'd lived by society's rules and expectations, being offered salvation by a man her culture considered a heathen and a savage. If I go with you, she said, what becomes of me? You become what you choose to become, he replied simply. Free or bound, that is your decision to make. Free or bound. As they walked toward the door, the man turned to Morrison and tossed another gold coin onto the table. For your trouble, he said with casual contempt. And then they were gone, stepping out into the cold night air and leaving behind a room full of stunned, angry men and one woman who'd just learned that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources. Margaret Sullivan's old life was over. What would rise from its ashes remained to be seen. The cold night air hit Margaret's face like a slap, shocking her into the reality of what she'd just done. Behind them, the saloon doors swung shut, muffling but not silencing the angry voices within. She could hear Morrison's bellowing above the rest, no doubt rallying the crowd for pursuit. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, as if she were walking on shifting sand instead of solid ground. "This way," the Comanche said quietly, his hand touching her elbow with surprising gentleness. "Quickly, but do not run. Running shows fear, and fear invites pursuit." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure he could see the gesture in the darkness. Her rescuer, for that's what he was, wasn't he, moved with the silent confidence of someone completely at home in the night. The boy walked close beside him, his small hand resting on what Margaret now realized was a knife handle protruding from his belt. "My horse," Margaret said, suddenly remembering the old mare Thomas had left behind. "I should leave her," the man said firmly. "She is old and slow, and we have far to travel before dawn. My horses are faster, stronger. They will carry us to safety." Safety. The word sounded foreign in Margaret's ears. She'd almost forgotten what it meant to feel safe, to trust that tomorrow might bring something better than today. Following this stranger into the wilderness seemed like madness, but staying in Bitter Creek was certain doom. They reached the edge of town where 3 horses waited in the shadows. 2 magnificent painted ponies and a sturdy bay pack horse loaded with supplies. The animals stood perfectly still, as if they'd been carved from stone, but Margaret could see their ears swiveling toward every sound, alert for danger. "Can you ride?" the man asked, his voice low but urgent. "Yes," Margaret replied, though it had been months since she'd been on horseback. Thomas had sold their good horses early in his illness, keeping only the old mare for essential trips to town. "Good. Take the smaller paint, she is gentle but swift. We ride hard tonight, rest at dawn." He lifted the boy onto the larger horse with easy strength, then turned to help Margaret mount. His hands on her waist were warm through the thin fabric of her dress, steadying her as she found her seat on the unfamiliar horse. The paint mare shifted slightly under her weight, but remained calm, responding to some invisible signal from her master. "What's your name?" Margaret asked, as he swung onto his own mount with fluid grace. "Daniel Crow Feather," he replied, gathering his reins. "This is my son, Little Wolf." The boy nodded solemnly at her, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. He looked so young, yet there was an old soul quality about him that reminded Margaret of children who'd seen too much too soon. "I'm Margaret Sullivan." She paused, then added, "Thank you for what you did back there." Daniel's face was unreadable in the moonlight. "Thank me when we are safe. For now, we ride." They moved out of Bitter Creek like ghosts, the horses' hooves muffled on the dusty ground. Margaret looked back once and saw lights still burning in Morrison's saloon shadows, moving behind the windows like puppets in some macabre show. Part of her couldn't believe she was really leaving, really abandoning everything she'd ever known for the complete unknown. The landscape changed as they rode the flat plains, giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and pine. Daniel led them along paths that seemed invisible in the darkness, but the horses followed without hesitation, their sure feet finding secure footing even on rocky slopes. Margaret marveled at his navigation skills, wondering how anyone could move with such confidence through terrain that looked identical to her untrained eye. After what felt like hours of silent riding, Daniel finally called a halt near a small stream bordered by cottonwood trees. The horses were breathing hard, but not distressed steam rising from their coats in the cool night air. "We rest here until dawn," Daniel announced, dismounting with his usual fluid grace. "The horses need water, and we need to talk." Margaret slid down from her mount, her legs shaky from the unaccustomed ride. Little Wolf immediately began tending to the animals with practiced efficiency, removing bits and bridles, leading them to the stream to drink. It was clear this was routine for them, a well-rehearsed ritual of life on the trail. "Sit," Daniel said, gesturing to a fallen log near the water's edge. "You have questions. Ask them." Margaret settled onto the makeshift seat, suddenly aware of how her silk wedding dress looked in this wild setting, absurdly formal, ridiculously impractical. She felt like an actor who'd wandered onto the wrong stage, still wearing the costume from a different play entirely. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why did you help me? You don't know me. You owe me nothing. You could have ridden past that saloon and never looked back." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flowing water. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully contained, but never fully healed. "7 years ago, my wife was taken by white soldiers during a raid on our camp. They said she was being rescued from savage captivity. Even though she had been born, Comanche had lived her entire life among our people." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I never saw her again. I heard later that she died in a reservation school, trying to become white, trying to forget everything she was." Margaret felt her throat constrict with unexpected emotion. "I'm sorry. That's horrible. When I saw you in that place tonight, standing like prey before predators, I saw her face. I saw what happens when people decide that another human being is worth less than the paper their debts are written on." His dark eyes found hers across the small space between them. "No one should be sold like livestock. No one. But taking me with you, what does that accomplish? I mean, what do you expect from me?" Margaret tried to keep her voice steady, but uncertainty crept in despite her efforts. "I don't know your ways. I don't speak your language. I can't even ride properly." Little Wolf looked up from where he was hobbling the horses, his young voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Father says you have fire in your eyes, like Mama did." The simple statement hit Margaret harder than she'd expected. Fire in her eyes. Is that what Daniel had seen when he'd looked at her across that saloon? She'd felt so beaten down, so defeated. Could there really be fire left in her? "Little Wolf speaks truth," Daniel said quietly. "You stood before those men with your head high, even when they treated you like garbage to be disposed of. That takes courage, strength. Those qualities can be built upon. And if I can't adapt, if I'm too weak, too soft for the life you lead." Daniel's smile was barely visible in the starlight, but she caught the flash of white teeth. "Then you will die. But you would have died in that town too, just more slowly and with less dignity." The brutal honesty of his response should have terrified her, but instead Margaret found it oddly comforting. No false promises, no gentle lies to cushion harsh reality, just truth clean and sharp as a blade. "Where are we going?" she asked. "North to winter camp. My band is small, 30 people, mostly women and children and old ones. We move with the season's hunt, when game is plentiful trade, when we must fight only when we have no choice." Daniel's voice carried a note of pride mixed with resignation. "It is not the old life. The old life is gone, killed by railroads and settlements and the white man's hunger for land, but it is still life, still freedom of a sort. And I would be welcome there, a white woman. Some will welcome you, others will not. You will have to earn your place, prove your worth. Nothing will be given to you simply because you exist." His tone was matter-of-fact, neither cruel nor particularly kind. "Can you work? Can you learn?" Margaret thought about the years of managing a frontier household, of making do with next to nothing, of nursing Thomas through his final illness while keeping their small farm running. "Yes," she said with growing confidence. "Yes, I can work." "Good. Work is respected among my people. Laziness is not tolerated, but neither is anyone left to starve if they contribute what they can." Little Wolf finished with the horses and came to sit beside his father, close enough to touch, but maintaining the careful reserve Margaret had noticed earlier. The boy had a quality of watchfulness that seemed beyond his years, as if he'd learned early that survival depended on reading the subtle signs of danger and opportunity. "How old are you, Little Wolf?" Margaret asked gently. 10 winters, he replied, then added with obvious pride, "I have killed my first deer. Father says I will be a great hunter." "I'm sure you will be." Margaret studied his serious face, seeing echoes of Daniel in the strong jawline and proud bearing. "Do you remember your mother?" The boy's expression clouded slightly. Some. She sang to me and she smelled like sage and sweetgrass. She made me a shirt with blue beads that I outgrew before. He trailed off, looking to his father for guidance. Before the soldiers came, Daniel finished quietly. Little Wolf was 5 when we lost her. Old enough to remember, too young to understand why. Margaret felt a sudden fierce urge to comfort this solemn child who'd lost his mother to the same kind of prejudice and cruelty she'd just escaped. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, a white woman fleeing white men's violence, finding refuge among people her own culture considered savage. "What happens now?" she asked. "I mean, practically speaking, am I your property, your wife, your servant?" The questions tumbled out in a rush, driven by the need to understand her new circumstances. Daniel was quiet for so long that Margaret began to wonder if she'd offended him. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen. "Among my people, a man may have more than one wife if he can provide for them, and if the women agree to the arrangement. But marriage is not ownership. A woman can leave if she chooses, taking her children and her belongings with her." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "You are not my wife. You are not my servant. You are a debt I chose to pay, a responsibility I took on freely. What you become beyond that depends on your choices and mine." "That's not really an answer," Margaret said, though not unkindly. "Because there is no simple answer. We will learn together what your place should be. For now, you are under my protection. That means you eat what we eat, sleep where we sleep, work as we work. In return, you give your labor and your loyalty to the band. It is not complicated." But it was complicated, and they both knew it. Margaret was a white woman in a Comanche camp, a situation fraught with potential dangers, both internal and external. The authorities would consider her kidnapped, the rescue attempts inevitable. Her mere presence could bring disaster down on these people who'd done nothing worse than show her kindness. What if someone comes looking for me, the army, or... She couldn't bring herself to mention Morrison and the others, but Daniel understood. They will look, yes, but finding us is not easy, and winter comes soon. Snow will cover our tracks, and the soldiers do not like to fight in snow. His voice carried the confidence of someone who'd evaded pursuit before. By spring, you will either be dead gone back to the white world, or become so much a part of us that it will not matter what they want. The casualness with which he mentioned her potential death should have been alarming, but Margaret found it oddly reassuring. He wasn't making false promises about safety or protection. He was simply stating the reality of their situation, allowing her to make informed decisions about her fate. Little Wolf had been listening to their conversation with the intense focus children brought to adult discussions that might affect their lives. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying a note of curiosity. "Will she live in our lodge, Father? Will she share our food and our fire?" "If she chooses to," Daniel replied, "and if the council agrees to accept her. Remember, Little Wolf, she is not Comanche. She knows nothing of our ways, our customs, our beliefs. Teaching her will require patience." "I had patience with the injured hawk you brought home last spring," Little Wolf said seriously. "It bit me many times, but eventually it learned to trust me. Maybe she will too." Margaret couldn't help but smile at being compared to an injured hawk, though the analogy was uncomfortably apt. She was wounded, defensive, trapped in circumstances beyond her control. The question was whether she had the strength to heal, to learn to trust again. "I don't bite," she said with gentle humor. "Not usually, anyway." Little Wolf's solemn expression cracked slightly, revealing a hint of the child beneath the serious exterior. "Good. Father says biting people is rude unless they attack you first." "Your father sounds very wise," Margaret said, glancing at Daniel and finding his dark eyes watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Wisdom comes from surviving mistakes," he said dryly. "I have made many mistakes, so by that measure, I should be very wise indeed." The eastern horizon was beginning to show the first faint hints of dawn. the absolute darkness giving way to deep blue-gray. Daniel rose smoothly to his feet, his movements as fluid as water despite what must have been his own exhaustion. "We should move soon. Full daylight will bring pursuit, and I want to be well away from here when it comes." He began gathering their few belongings, his actions efficient and practiced. "Can you ride hard today? We have many miles to cover before we can rest properly." Margaret stood as well, working the stiffness from her joints. Her silk dress was already showing the effects of their night ride, dust-stained and torn in places, the fine fabric ill-suited to frontier travel. "I'll manage," she said, though privately she wondered if that was true. She'd ridden as a girl, but always sedately with proper saddles and gentle horses on well-maintained trails. This was different, raw, demanding, potentially dangerous. "Good. Little Wolf, prepare the horses. We leave as soon as the light is strong enough to see the trail clearly." The boy nodded and moved toward the animals with quick efficiency. Margaret watched him work, marveling at his competence despite his youth. In her world, 10-year-old boys played with hoops and marbles, learned their letters, and numbers were sheltered from the harsh realities of adult life. Little Wolf bridled horses, spoke of hunting, and survival, carried weapons as naturally as other children carried toys. "He's very mature for his age," she observed. "He has to be. Childhood is a luxury we cannot afford." Daniel's voice carried no self-pity, just simple acceptance of circumstances. "Among my people, children learn early that life is hard and death comes quickly to those who are not prepared. Little Wolf has been riding since he could walk, hunting since he was 7, fighting since he was 8. It is the only way to ensure he survives to become a man." Margaret nodded, understanding but saddened by the necessity. In losing her own childhood innocence, she'd gained some appreciation for how precious and fragile it was. To see a child robbed of that innocence by circumstances beyond his control stirred something protective in her heart. "The horses are ready, Father," Little Wolf announced, leading the animals toward them. In the growing light, Margaret could see the paint mare she'd ridden, a beautiful animal with intelligent eyes and a proud bearing that seemed to mirror her riders. "What's her name?" Margaret asked as she prepared to mount. "Windrunner," Daniel replied, giving her a boost into the saddle. "She has carried warriors into battle and mothers to safety. She will not fail you." The compliment was indirect, but unmistakable. By giving Margaret his war horse to ride, Daniel was showing a level of trust and respect that spoke louder than words. She settled into the saddle with growing confidence, feeling the mare's responsive spirit beneath her. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern hills, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The beauty of the sunrise struck Margaret with unexpected force. When had she last taken time to appreciate such simple wonders? In Bitter Creek, sunrise had meant another day of worry, another day of problems to solve with diminishing resources. Here, it meant possibility, adventure, the chance to discover what lay beyond the next ridge. Daniel set a punishing pace, pushing the horses hard across terrain that seemed to grow wilder and more rugged with each passing mile. They followed game trails and creek beds, avoided open spaces where they might be spotted, navigated through stands of timber and across rocky outcrops that would make tracking difficult. Margaret found herself tested to her limits as the morning progressed. Her muscles ached from the unaccustomed exercise, her hands grew raw from gripping the reins, and her silk dress became increasingly tattered. But she didn't complain, didn't ask for rest or water. Some deep instinct told her that this was a test, that her ability to keep up without protest would determine how she was viewed by her companions. Little Wolf rode beside her much of the time, offering wordless encouragement and occasional guidance when the trail became particularly treacherous. His presence was oddly comforting, this serious child, who'd accepted her into their small group without question or reservation. In his eyes, she saw none of the judgment or contempt that had characterized her final days in Bitter Creek. "You ride well," he said during one of their brief stops to rest the horses. Better than the white women the soldiers sometimes bring through our territory. Thank you, Margaret replied, touched by his approval, though I suspect I look like I've been trampled by a buffalo. Little Wolf studied her critically, taking in her disheveled appearance with the frank assessment of childhood. Yes, he agreed solemnly, but a very brave buffalo. Father says courage matters more than appearance. His innocent honesty made her laugh, the first genuine laughter she'd felt in months. The sound seemed to surprise both of them, but it also seemed to lighten the mood, making the harsh landscape seem a little less forbidding. Your father is right about many things, Margaret said. I hope I can prove worthy of his trust. You already have, Little Wolf replied with simple conviction. You chose to come with us instead of staying with the bad men. That shows you have good judgment. The vote of confidence from this grave child meant more to Margaret than she'd expected. In her old world, children's opinions hadn't carried much weight. Here, where survival depended on reading character accurately, even a 10-year-old's assessment had value. They rode on through the morning and into the afternoon, the sun climbing high and hot despite the approaching autumn. Margaret's dress was soaked with perspiration. Her hair had escaped its pins and hung in tangled strands around her face, and her hands were cramping from their death grip on the reins. But she endured, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change again. The hills grew steeper and more heavily forested, the air cooler and thinner. Margaret realized they were climbing into higher country, following ancient paths that wound through valleys and across ridges with breathtaking view of the wilderness beyond. How much farther? She asked, during one of their brief stops, trying to keep the exhaustion from her voice. Still far, Daniel replied, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. But we are making good time. The horses are strong, and you— He paused, studying her with those dark, unreadable eyes. You are stronger than you appeared in that saloon. I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm falling apart. Strength is not always about feeling strong, Daniel said quietly. Sometimes it is about continuing when you feel weak, about choosing the difficult path when the easy one leads to destruction. You have made such choices today. Margaret looked at him more closely, seeing past the warrior's stoic exterior to something deeper. A man who'd faced his own share of difficult choices, who understood the cost of survival in a world that offered few mercies. There was wisdom on his weathered face, earned through experience rather than education. Tell me about your band, she said, as they prepared to ride again. What should I expect when we reach them? Daniel mounted his horse with his usual fluid grace, settling into the saddle as if he'd been born there. They are good people, but they have learned to be suspicious of outsiders. Too many of our friends have been betrayed by those we trusted. You will need to prove yourself slowly, carefully. And how do I do that? By working without complaint, by learning our ways without judgment, by showing respect for our customs, even when they seem strange to you. He gathered his reins, preparing to move out. Most importantly, by remembering that you are no longer a white woman who happens to be among Indians. You are someone trying to become part of something larger than yourself. The distinction was subtle but important, Margaret realized. She couldn't simply be a tourist in their world, observing and judging from the safety of her own cultural assumptions. She had to be willing to change, to adapt, to become something new. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Margaret found herself thinking about transformation, about the caterpillar that died to become a butterfly, about the grain of wheat that had to be buried in order to bear fruit. Perhaps that's what was happening to her, she thought. The woman who'd stood in that saloon, who'd lived in fear and desperation, was dying. What would be born from her remains was still unknown. The afternoon shadows grew longer as they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew thin and sharp, carrying scents of pine and sage that seemed to cleanse Margaret's lungs of the stale atmosphere of civilization. She could feel something shifting inside her, not just physically, though. The hard riding was certainly changing her body, but spiritually, emotionally. For the first time in months, she felt alive. "There," Daniel said, suddenly pointing toward a ridge ahead of them. "Do you see the smoke?" Margaret squinted in the direction he indicated, and finally made out thin wisps of gray against the darkening sky. "Is that home?" Little Wolf said, with unmistakable joy in his voice. "We are almost home, Father." Margaret felt a strange mixture of anticipation and terror. In a few hours she would meet the people who might become her new family, her new community. They would judge her, test her, decide whether she was worth the risk of accepting. Her future, perhaps her very survival, would depend on their verdict. But as they urged the tired horses up the final steep trail toward the smoke and the promise of shelter, Margaret realized something had changed. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. She had ridden hard all day, had kept up with experienced riders across difficult terrain, had endured discomfort without complaint. She had survived the first test. Now came the real challenge, learning to live again, to trust again, to love again. The woman who'd been sold like trash in a frontier saloon was gone forever. What would rise from her ashes remained to be seen, but Margaret was beginning to believe it might be something remarkable, something worth the price she'd paid to become it. The smoke grew thicker as they crested the final ridge, and Margaret's first glimpse of the Comanche camp took her breath away. Nestled in a protected valley surrounded by towering pines and red rock formations, dozens of buffalo hide lodges stood in a rough circle around a central fire pit. The scene looked like something from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, depending on one's perspective. Children's voices carried on the evening air, mixing with the sounds of horses nickering and dogs barking. The normalcy of it struck Margaret as profoundly strange. She'd expected something more primitive, more savage, but this looked like any frontier community at the end of a long day. Women tended cooking fires while children played nearby, and men sat in small groups discussing the day's events. "Stay close," Daniel murmured as they began their descent into the valley. "Let me speak first. Some of these people have never seen a white woman who wasn't trying to kill them or convert them." Margaret nodded, her throat suddenly dry with nervousness. The weight of curious eyes was already upon her as people emerged from their lodges to watch the arrival of the three riders. She could hear voices calling out in Comanche words she couldn't understand, but whose tone ranged from welcoming to suspicious to openly hostile. Little Wolf straightened in his saddle with obvious pride as they rode into the camp proper. This was his homecoming, his moment of triumph after successful travel with his father. But Margaret could see him glancing at her frequently, as if worried about how she would be received. An elderly woman approached as they dismounted, her weathered face stern but not unkind. She wore traditional dress, a fringed buckskin tunic decorated with intricate beadwork, and her gray hair was braided with silver ornaments that caught the firelight. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Crow Feather returns with more than his son," she said in accented but clear English. "What have you brought into our midst?" "Grandmother Owl Singing," Daniel replied respectfully, using what Margaret assumed was a title of honor rather than a family relationship. "This is Margaret. She has chosen to leave the white world behind." The old woman's sharp eyes fixed on Margaret with uncomfortable intensity, taking in every detail from her torn silk dress to her raw hands to the exhaustion she tried to hide. The examination seemed to last forever, though it was probably only seconds. "Chosen or been driven?" Owl Singing asked bluntly. "There is a difference." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to meet the elder's gaze directly. "Both," she said honestly. "I was driven from my old life, but I chose to come here instead of accepting what waited for me there." Owl Singing's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested Margaret had given the right answer. "And what did wait for you in the white world, child? Slavery disguised as marriage," Margaret replied, surprising herself with her directness. Men who saw me as property to be bought and used. A murmur ran through the growing crowd of onlookers. Some nodded with understanding while others remained skeptical. Margaret realized she was being tested not just by owl singing, but by the entire community, each person forming judgments that would shape her future here. She has ridden hard for 2 days without complaint. Little Wolf spoke up suddenly, his young voice clear and proud. She kept up with us even when the trail was dangerous. Daniel placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, both approving and cautioning. Little Wolf speaks truth. She has shown courage and endurance. Courage can be faked, said a harsh male voice from the back of the crowd. Endurance can be temporary. What matters is what lives in her heart. The speaker pushed forward a man perhaps Daniel's age with a scarred face and hostile eyes that seemed to burn with old anger. When he looked at Margaret, she saw such hatred that she instinctively stepped closer to Daniel. Broken Hawk, Daniel said carefully, his own voice taking on a warning tone. She is under my protection. Your protection. Broken Hawk's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Like your wife was under your protection. How did that work out, brother? The words hit Daniel like physical blows, and Margaret saw him stiffen with pain and rage. The crowd had gone completely silent, sensing the dangerous undercurrents in the exchange. Even the children had stopped playing, their bright chatter replaced by tense quiet. That is enough, Owl Singing said sharply, her authority cutting through the hostility like a blade. Broken Hawk, your grief does not give you the right to wound others needlessly. Grief. Broken Hawk's voice rose to something approaching a shout. I speak of wisdom. How many more of our people must die because we trust what we should not trust? Margaret felt the weight of hostile stares from several of the gathered people, and she began to understand that this was about more than her arrival. There were old wounds here, old betrayals that had left deep scars on the community's soul. What happened to your wife? She asked Daniel quietly, though she feared the answer. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. She was killed trying to escape from a reservation school, shot down like a rabid dog while running toward home. His dark eyes found hers burning with pain that had never fully healed. Broken Hawk blames me for trusting the soldiers who took her. He says I should have fought, should have died trying to protect her. Should you have? Margaret asked the question, slipping out before she could stop it. The brutal honesty of her words seemed to catch Daniel off guard. He studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read something written there in a language he didn't quite understand. Perhaps, he said finally, that is a question that haunts me every night. Owl Singing stepped between them, her weathered hands raised for peace. Enough talk of old sorrows. The sun sets, and we have practical matters to address. She turned to Margaret with renewed scrutiny. You say you choose to be here, white woman, but choice requires understanding. Do you know what you have chosen? Margaret looked around the circle of faces, some curious, some hostile, some simply waiting to see what would happen next. These were people who had lost family members, friends, entire ways of life to the relentless westward expansion of her own culture. They had every reason to hate her, to see her as a threat or a spy. I know I've chosen the unknown over the certain, Margaret said slowly. I know I've chosen people who have every reason to reject me over people who should have protected me but didn't. Beyond that, she spread her hands in a gesture of honest uncertainty. I suppose I'll learn as I go. Learning requires teaching, Owl Singing observed, and teaching requires patience from both student and teacher. Are you willing to work for your place here, to earn it through service, rather than expect it as a right? Yes, Margaret said without hesitation. I've worked all my life. I'm not afraid of hard labor. Good, because winter comes soon and there is much to prepare. You will help the women with their tasks. You will learn our ways, our language, our customs. Most importantly, you will prove that you can be trusted with the lives and safety of our children. Margaret nodded, understanding the implicit threat in those words. If she proved untrustworthy, if she brought danger to the band through treachery or incompetence, the consequences would be severe. "Where will I sleep?" she asked practically. Owl Singing looked to Daniel, her eyebrows raised in silent question. Margaret saw him hesitate, clearly wrestling with implications she didn't fully understand. "She can share our lodge," Little Wolf said suddenly. "There is room, and I can help teach her our language." "A woman alone in a warrior's lodge." Broken Hawk's voice dripped with implication. "How convenient." Daniel's hand moved to his knife hilt, in a motion so fluid it seemed unconscious. "What are you suggesting, brother?" "Nothing that hasn't occurred to others," Broken Hawk replied coolly. "A white woman, a widowed warrior, a lonely winter ahead. The math is simple enough." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She was trapped between two interpretations, both humiliating in their own way. Either she was seen as Daniel's concubine brought back as a prize for his bed, or she was viewed as a burden he'd foolishly taken on out of misguided charity. "I can sleep alone," she said quietly. "I don't want to cause problems." "Alone where?" Owl Singing asked practically. "We have no extra lodges, and winter shelter is too valuable to waste. You must stay somewhere." "She stays with us," Daniel said firmly. "Little Wolf is right. There is room, and he can help with teaching. Anyone who questions the arrangement is welcome to challenge me directly." The words were clearly directed at Broken Hawk, who seemed to consider the implied challenge before shaking his head with disgust. "I have no quarrel with you, Crow Feather, only with your judgment." He turned and walked away, several other hostile faces following in his wake. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama faded, but Margaret could feel the weight of continuing scrutiny. She would be watched, judged, discussed around countless fires in the nights to come. Every action would be analyzed, every mistake magnified, every success questioned. "Come," Little Wolf said, taking her hand with the easy trust of childhood. "I will show you our home." Daniel's lodge was larger than most, reflecting his status as an accomplished warrior and provider. The interior was comfortable and practical, with sleeping furs arranged around the edges and a central fire pit that vented through the smoke hole at the top. Personal belongings were stored in parfleche containers, decorated with geometric designs in bright colors. "Mother's things," Little Wolf explained, noticing Margaret's gaze lingering on a particularly beautiful parfleche painted with stylized birds. "Father keeps them to remember her." Margaret nodded, understanding the complex emotions such reminders must evoke. She was stepping into the space of a dead woman, occupying a place that rightfully belonged to another. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her like a physical burden. "You will sleep there," Daniel said, indicating a space near the lodge wall where extra furs had been arranged. "It is warm but private. Little Wolf and I sleep on the other side of the fire." The arrangement was practical and respectful, but Margaret couldn't help wondering what the other band members would make of it. In her world, unmarried men and women simply didn't share living spaces regardless of circumstances. Here, apparently, survival trumped social conventions. "I should help prepare the evening meal," she said, not wanting to seem lazy or presumptuous. "Tomorrow," Owl Singing said from the lodge entrance. She had followed them inside, her sharp eyes taking inventory of the domestic arrangements. "Tonight you rest and we talk. There are things you must understand before you begin trying to fit in." Margaret settled gratefully onto the soft furs, her body aching from the long ride and the emotional stress of the day. Little Wolf busied himself with small tasks around the lodge while Daniel stepped outside to tend to the horses and speak with other men of the band. "You are afraid," Owl Singing observed, settling cross-legged beside Margaret with the easy grace of someone who'd been sitting on the ground for 70 years. "Yes," Margaret admitted. There seemed little point in lying to this sharp-eyed woman who seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Good. Fear keeps you alert, keeps you from making foolish mistakes. but too much fear makes you useless. Owl Singing studied Margaret's face with clinical interest. Tell me what frightens you most. Margaret considered the question seriously. Failure, I suppose. Not being strong enough or smart enough to survive here. Bringing danger to people who've shown me kindness. Being seen as worthless. All reasonable fears, the old woman acknowledged. But notice that none of them are about physical danger or discomfort. That tells me something about your character. What does it tell you? That you think more about others than yourself. That is rare in any world, but especially rare in the white world. Owl Singing's weathered hands worked automatically at some bit of beadwork while she spoke. But it can also be a weakness. Sometimes you must be selfish to survive. Sometimes you must choose your own needs over the comfort of others. Margaret thought about the choice she'd made in Morrison's saloon, leaving behind everything she'd ever known to follow a stranger into the wilderness. Had that been selfless or selfish? Perhaps both. Why is Broken Hawk so angry with Daniel? She asked. Owl Singing's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their steady work. Broken Hawk's sister was Daniel's wife. When the soldiers palmed, Broken Hawk wanted to fight, wanted all the warriors to die gloriously in battle rather than submit. Daniel counseled patience, tried to negotiate, believed the white promises of fair treatment. Her voice carried the weight of old sorrow. The soldiers took the women and children anyway, and most died in the schools or on the reservations. Now, Broken Hawk believes that any accommodation with the white world leads only to death and dishonor. And bringing me here proves to him that Daniel has learned nothing, that he still believes whites can be trusted or changed. Owl Singing looked directly at Margaret, her dark eyes intense. So you see, child, you are not just fighting for your own acceptance. You are fighting to prove that Daniel's faith in the possibility of understanding between our peoples is not misplaced. The weight of that responsibility was staggering. Margaret wasn't just trying to survive or find a place for herself. She was carrying the burden of representing her entire race. To people who had every reason to hate and mistrust her. One mistake, one moment of weakness or cultural insensitivity, and she could validate all of Broken Hawk's suspicions. What if I can't? She whispered. What if I'm not strong enough? Then you will die, and Daniel will lose what little faith he has left in anything beyond survival. Owl Singing's voice was matter-of-fact, neither cruel nor particularly sympathetic. But I do not think you are weak, Margaret. Weak women do not stand up to mobs of armed men. Weak women do not choose the unknown over the familiar, even when the familiar has become intolerable. Little Wolf returned to the lodge carrying bowls of stew and chunks of bread made from some kind of root flour Margaret didn't recognize. The food smelled wonderful after their long ride, and she realized she hadn't eaten anything substantial in almost 2 days. Eat, the boy commanded with the authority of someone used to taking care of others. Tomorrow you begin learning, but tonight you must rest and grow strong. The stew was delicious, rich with meat and vegetables she couldn't identify, but flavored with herbs that made her mouth water. She ate quickly, suddenly ravenous, while Little Wolf chattered about the day's events and the people she would meet tomorrow. Yellowbird will teach you to prepare hides, he said between bites of his own meal. She is very skilled and very patient, and Morning Dove will show you which plants are good for medicine and which are poisonous. She knows more about healing than anyone except Owl Singing. They've agreed to teach me, Margaret asked, surprised. Grandmother Owl Singing told them to, Little Wolf replied matter-of-factly. When grandmother tells people to do something, they do it. Margaret glanced at the old woman, who was pretending not to listen while working on her beadwork. Clearly, Owl Singing wielded considerable influence in the band, perhaps more than any of the male leaders. That was something Margaret would need to remember and respect. Daniel returned as full darkness settled over the camp, his face showing the strain of difficult conversations. He settled by the fire with a weary sigh, accepting the bowl of stew Little Wolf offered him. "How bad?" Owl Singing asked, without looking up from her work. "Not as bad as it could be, but not good either," Daniel replied honestly. "3 families want her gone immediately. 5 others are willing to wait and see. The rest are somewhere in between. And the council will meet tomorrow night to decide her fate formally." Daniel's eyes found Margaret across the fire. "You will be asked to speak for yourself, to explain why you should be allowed to stay. Think carefully about what you will say." Margaret nodded, though her stomach clenched with anxiety. Everything would depend on her performance before this council, people she'd never met, who would judge her worthiness based on a single conversation. "What should I say?" she asked. "The truth," Owl Singing replied before Daniel could speak. "Always the truth, even when it hurts. These people have heard too many white lies to tolerate even small deceptions. But what truth? That I was desperate, that I had no choice. That doesn't exactly make me sound like a valuable addition to the community." Daniel set down his empty bowl and studied her thoughtfully. "Tell them why you chose us over your own people. Tell them what you hope to give, not just what you hope to receive. And tell them—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Tell them you understand that acceptance must be earned, not granted." The conversation turned to practical matters, what Margaret would wear tomorrow, something more appropriate than her ruined silk dress, which tasks. She would begin with how she should address the various members of the band. But underneath the surface planning, Margaret sensed deeper currents of concern. She was a test case, an experiment in cross-cultural acceptance that could have profound consequences for the band's future. If she succeeded, it might open the door for other forms of cooperation and understanding. If she failed, it would reinforce the growing conviction that accommodation with the white world was impossible. As the fire burned low and the camp settled into sleep, Margaret lay on her borrowed furs and stared up through the smoke hole at the stars. They looked different here in the mountains, brighter and closer, unmarked by the haze of civilization. She was farther from her old life than she'd ever been, not just in distance, but in every way that mattered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the chance she'd been given. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace. The anxiety was still there, the fear of failure still very real, but underneath it all was a growing sense of possibility. She had chosen fire over ashes, the unknown over the unacceptable. Now she had to prove that choice had been wisdom rather than madness. From across the dying fire came the soft sound of Little Wolf's sleeping breath and the quieter rustle of Daniel turning in his blankets. She was sharing space with people who had every reason to see her as an enemy, yet who had offered her shelter and protection. The trust implied in that arrangement was both humbling and inspiring. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind raced with plans and worries. Tomorrow she would begin the real work of transformation, of becoming someone worthy of the faith that had been placed in her. The woman who had stood in Morrison's saloon was truly dead, now buried somewhere on the long trail from Bitter Creek to this mountain sanctuary. What would rise from those ashes remained to be seen, but Margaret Sullivan was determined to ensure it was something extraordinary, something worthy of the price that had been paid to create it. She drifted toward sleep with the sounds of the camp settling around her horses, shuffling in their makeshift corral dogs, barking briefly at some night sound, the murmur of voices from nearby lodges where families shared the day's events. It was the sound of community of people bound together by choice and necessity and mutual care. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret fell asleep feeling like she might truly belong somewhere. The feeling was fragile, uncertain, built more on hope than evidence. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was enough to carry her through the darkness toward whatever tomorrow might bring. In her dreams, she ran across open plains on a painted horse, her hair flowing free in the wind, her heart full of wild joy. She was no longer Margaret Sullivan, the desperate widow. She was something new, something that had no name yet but felt like freedom itself. The transformation had begun. Dawn came too soon, announced by the distant call of hunting birds and the stirring of the camp around them. Margaret woke to find little Wolf already up quietly stoking the fire and preparing what looked like a simple breakfast of dried meat and some kind of grain porridge. The domestic scene was oddly comforting, reminding her of mornings with Thomas before illness had stolen their simple routines. Daniel emerged from his side of the lodge, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned that noise could mean death. He studied Margaret with those dark, unreadable eyes, taking in her disheveled appearance and obvious exhaustion. "You slept poorly," he observed. "Strange dreams," Margaret replied, not wanting to admit that fear had kept her awake most of the night. "I'll adjust." "Dreams are important to my people," Little Wolf said seriously, looking up from his cooking. "What did you dream?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how to explain the vivid images that had haunted her sleep. "I dreamed I was riding across open country on a painted horse. I felt free." Daniel and Little Wolf exchanged a look that Margaret couldn't interpret, but something in their expressions suggested her words had carried more meaning than she'd intended. "Dreams of horses often speak of journey and change," Daniel said carefully. "But whether the change brings good or evil depends on many things." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, Owl Singing entered the lodge without ceremony, carrying a bundle of clothing that she dropped unceremoniously at Margaret's feet. "Your white woman's dress will not do for today's work," the elder announced bluntly. "Yellowbird has provided suitable clothing. You will wear it and begin learning our ways properly." Margaret unfolded the bundle to find a simple but well-made outfit of soft buckskin, a tunic decorated with modest beadwork and leggings that would allow for practical movement. The leather was supple and warm, clearly the work of skilled hands. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Please thank Yellowbird for her generosity." "Thank her yourself when you begin working with her this morning," Owl Singing replied. "But first you eat and then you bathe. The creek runs cold, but cleanliness is valued among civilized people." The implied criticism of her current state made Margaret's cheeks burn, but she nodded acceptance. Everything here was a test, every moment an opportunity to prove herself worthy or unworthy of continued tolerance. After a quick breakfast of the unfamiliar but nourishing porridge, Margaret followed Owl Singing to a bend in the creek, where the women of the band typically performed their morning ablutions. The water was indeed shockingly cold, fed by mountain snowmelt that made her gasp and shiver, but the feeling of being truly clean for the first time in days was worth the discomfort. The buckskin clothing fit surprisingly well, though it felt strange against skin accustomed to cotton and silk. The freedom of movement it allowed was remarkable. She could bend, reach, and walk without the constraining layers of petticoats and corsets that had defined feminine dress in her previous life. "You look more human now," Owl Singing observed with what might have been approval. "Less like a lost spirit wandering between worlds." Margaret caught her reflection in a still pool and barely recognized the woman looking back. The severe bun had given way to hair that hung loose around her shoulders. The pale complexion was already showing signs of sun exposure, and the simple buckskin clothing made her look like someone who belonged in this wild landscape rather than fighting against it. "Now we begin your education," Owl Singing announced, leading Margaret back toward the camp. "First lesson observation. Watch how people interact, who speaks and who listens, who has authority and who defers. Understanding the structure of our community will help you find your place within it." The morning proved to be an intensive course in cultural anthropology. Margaret watched as decisions were made through consensus rather than decree, as children were taught by the entire community rather than just their parents, as resources were shared according to need rather than individual ownership. The differences from her previous world were profound and sometimes confusing. Yellowbird proved to be a woman of perhaps 30 years with kind eyes and patient hands. She set Margaret to work immediately, teaching her to prepare buffalo hides for various uses: clothing, lodge covers, storage containers. The work was physically demanding and required skills Margaret had never needed before, but Yellowbird proved to be an excellent teacher. The hide must be scraped clean of all meat and fat, Yellowbird explained, demonstrating the proper angle and pressure for the scraping tool. Any remaining flesh will rot and ruin the leather. Like people, all the old dead parts must be removed before something new and useful can be created. Margaret wondered if the comment was meant metaphorically as well as literally. She attacked the hide with perhaps more vigor than necessary, scraping away not just meat and fat, but symbolically removing the remnants of her former life. "You work hard," observed Mourning Dove, the medicine woman who had joined them at Yellowbird's invitation. "But you work angry. Anger makes the hands clumsy and the mind clouded." "I'm not angry," Margaret protested, then stopped herself. These women could probably read emotions as easily as tracking signs in soft earth. Lying would only diminish their respect for her. "Yes, I suppose I am angry at the men who put me in this position, at the world that gave me so few choices, at myself for not being stronger sooner." "Good," Mourning Dove said, matter-of-factly. "Anger can be useful if it drives you forward rather than holding you back, but eventually you must release it, or it will poison you from within." The morning's work was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at speed. Margaret looked up from her scraping to see a group of warriors riding hard into camp, their faces grim with news that made the entire community suddenly alert. Daniel emerged from a council meeting with several of the band's elders, his expression darker than Margaret had yet seen it. He strode directly to where the women were working, his urgent pace suggesting serious trouble. "What is it?" Yellowbird asked before he could speak. "Riders from the south," Daniel replied tersely. "A large group of white men, well armed, asking questions about a missing woman. They are following our trail." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice water. Morrison and his cronies had come after her just as Daniel had predicted, but she'd hoped they would have given up by now, satisfied with her disappearance and the money Daniel had paid. "How many?" Owl Singing asked, materializing beside them with her usual silent efficiency. "The scouts count at least 20, possibly more. They have a tracker with them, someone who knows our ways." Daniel's eyes found Margaret, and she saw regret there along with determination. "They will find us within 2 days, perhaps sooner." "Then we move," Yellowbird said practically. "Pack the essentials, abandon what we cannot carry quickly." "No," Daniel's voice carried absolute authority. "We are prepared for winter here. The hunting is good, the shelter adequate, the water clean. Moving now would mean hardship for the children and elders, possibly death for some of the weaker ones." "Then what do you propose?" Mourning Dove asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the mountains. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of command, decisions made under impossible circumstances. "We fight." The simple statement sent a ripple of tension through the small group. Margaret realized with growing horror that these people were prepared to risk their lives rather than simply hand her over to her pursuers. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. "No," she said firmly, surprising everyone, including herself. "I won't let you fight my battles. Give me a horse and supplies and I'll leave on my own. Lead them away from here." "And go where?" Daniel asked bluntly. "Back to the men who wanted to use you like livestock. Forward into wilderness you don't know how to survive. There is nowhere for you to run, Margaret." "Then I'll make a stand somewhere else, away from your people. This isn't your fight." "It became our fight when I paid your price," Daniel replied, and something in his voice made Margaret look at him more closely. There was more than duty in his expression, more than simple honor. A Comanche warrior does not abandon what he has claimed. claimed. The word hung in the air between them like smoke carrying implications. Margaret wasn't sure she understood. Was she property to him, something owned and therefore protected, or was there something deeper, more personal in his determination to keep her safe? "How many of our warriors can fight?" Owl Singing asked practically. 15, perhaps 16 if we count the older boys, Daniel replied, against 20 or more well-armed whites with military experience. The mathematics were grim, but nobody suggested surrender. These people had been fighting overwhelming odds for so long that it had become a way of life rather than a cause for despair. "We have advantages," Little Wolf said, suddenly his young voice carrying surprising authority. "We know this country. We can choose the ground, choose the time. Make them come to us where we are strongest." Daniel looked at his son with obvious pride, but also with the pain of a father who knew he might be asking a child to face adult dangers. "That is good thinking, my son, but these are not soldiers following army rules. They are angry men seeking what they believe is theirs. They may not be so easily maneuvered." Margaret listened to the tactical discussion with growing desperation. These people were calmly planning a battle that might destroy their small community, all because she had been too weak or too proud to find another solution to her problems. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Some compromise, some negotiation, with men who sell women like cattle." Broken Hawk's voice cut across her words like a blade. He had approached unnoticed, his scarred face twisted with bitter satisfaction. "This is what comes of trusting whites, brother. This is the price of your soft heart." "Speak plainly, Broken Hawk," Daniel replied, his own voice taking on a dangerous edge. "What would you have us do?" "Give them what they came for," Broken Hawk said bluntly, his eyes fixed on Margaret with undisguised contempt. "One woman is not worth the lives of our warriors, the safety of our children." The brutal logic of his words was undeniable, but it was also unacceptable to everything Daniel seemed to believe about honor and responsibility. Margaret could see the conflict playing out in his face, duty to his people versus duty to his word, practical necessity versus personal conviction. "She is under my protection," Daniel said finally. "That protection does not end because it becomes inconvenient." "Your protection?" Broken Hawk's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Like your wife was under your protection. We see how well that worked." This time Daniel's hand went to his knife, and Margaret realized they were moments away from violence that could tear the band apart even before the external threat arrived. She had to act, had to find some way to prevent the destruction her presence was causing. "Stop," she said firmly, stepping between the two men. "Both of you stop this right now." The sheer audacity of a newcomer, a white woman newcomer intervening in a dispute between warriors, seemed to shock everyone into temporary silence. "Broken Hawk is right about one thing," Margaret continued, her voice carrying despite her racing heart. "I'm not worth destroying this community. But Daniel is right, too. There has to be a way to fight that doesn't require surrender of what's right." "Such as?" Owl Singing asked, her sharp eyes studying Margaret with renewed interest. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, rejecting most as quickly as she thought of them. These men hadn't come all this way to negotiate or compromise. They wanted her back, wanted to complete the transaction they believed they were entitled to. But they also wanted to avoid unnecessary casualties if possible. Dead men couldn't spend their money or enjoy their prizes. "What if we made them think they'd won?" she said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke. "What if they thought they were getting what they came for?" "Explain," Daniel said tersely. "They want me, but they also want to avoid a costly fight if they can help it. What if we offered them a trade me willingly, surrendering in exchange for safe passage for the band?" And then Morning Dove asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to follow Margaret's reasoning. "Then we spring a trap. Let them think they've won, let them get comfortable, maybe even let them start back toward town. Then we take them when they're not expecting it. Broken Hawk shook his head with disgust. More white trickery, more lies and deception. Sometimes deception is the only weapon the weak have against the strong, Margaret replied sharply. And like it or not, we are weaker in numbers and firepower. We have to be smarter. Daniel studied her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and Margaret could almost see him working through the tactical implications of her suggestion. It could work, he said slowly, if we plan it carefully, if we choose the right ground, if they believe the deception completely. It's too dangerous, Yellowbird protested. If something goes wrong, if they suspect a trap, Margaret could be killed, or worse, before we can rescue her. If we fight them here, people will certainly be killed, Margaret replied. Children might die, elders might not survive if we have to flee in winter. At least this way the risk falls on me instead of innocent people. The debate continued for another hour with various members of the band offering opinions, objections, and tactical suggestions. But gradually, reluctantly, consensus began to form around Margaret's desperate proposal. It was dangerous, dependent on perfect timing and flawless execution, but it offered the best chance of protecting the community while still maintaining honor. Very well, Daniel said finally. We tried deception first, violence only if deception fails. But understand this, Margaret, if the trap fails, if they discover our plan, we will fight to the death, rather than let them take you back to their kind of slavery. Margaret nodded, understanding the commitment she was asking of these people. They were willing to die for her, for a principle, for the idea that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. The rest of the day was spent in frantic preparation. Scouts were sent out to track the approaching riders and choose the best location for the ambush. Weapons were cleaned and sharpened, though the band's arsenal was limited compared to what their enemies would be carrying. Most importantly, Margaret was coached in her role as the surrendering victim. You must seem defeated but not broken. Owl singing instructed her as the sun began to set. Resigned to your fate but not dead inside. If you appear too willing, they will suspect a trap. If you seem too defiant, they may decide to make an example of you. Margaret nodded, though privately she wondered if she could pull off such a delicate performance when the moment came. Acting had never been one of her skills, and the stakes for a poor performance would be measured in lives. Little Wolf approached as she sat by the fire, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The boy's face was solemn, and she could see that he understood far more about the next day's dangers than any child should have to. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. Margaret considered lying, giving him the kind of comforting platitude adults usually offered children in difficult times, but something in his serious eyes told her he deserved honesty. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm terrified, but sometimes being afraid doesn't matter if the alternative is worse." "Father is afraid too," Little Wolf confided, glancing toward where Daniel stood with the other warriors planning the details of their ambush. "I can tell even though he tries to hide it." "That's because he's smart," Margaret replied. "Only fools aren't afraid when there's real danger." "Will you come back?" The question was asked in a small voice that made Margaret's heart clench. "After the fighting, will you stay with us?" Margaret looked at this grave child who'd lost one mother already, who was now facing the possibility of losing the woman who'd been placed in his care. The weight of his trust and affection was both precious and terrifying. "I'll try," she promised. "I can't guarantee what will happen tomorrow, but I promise I'll fight to come back to you and your father." Little Wolf nodded solemnly, then surprised her by reaching into his shirt and pulling out a small object carved from what looked like elk antler. "This was my mother's," he said, pressing it into Margaret's hand. "It's a spirit horse for protection and speed. She would want you to have it." Margaret looked down at the tiny carved horse, its flowing mane and proud stance captured with remarkable skill in the small piece of antler. The gift was more precious than gold, representing acceptance from a child whose opinion mattered more than she'd realized. "Thank you," she whispered, closing her fingers around the small talisman. "I'll treasure it always." As night fell over the camp, Margaret found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Tomorrow would bring the greatest test of her new life, a trial that could end in death for herself and others. She lay on her borrowed furs, fingering the small horse carving and trying to find courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Daniel approached in the darkness, moving with his usual silent grace. He settled beside her near the dying fire, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence without impropriety. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "Third and fourth thoughts," Margaret admitted, "but no better options." "There is always another option," Daniel said carefully. "We could still run, could abandon this camp and find another. My people have been running from superior forces for generations." "And how's that working out for them?" Margaret asked with gentle irony. Daniel's soft laugh held little humor. "Not well. We grow fewer every year, weaker with each retreat. Perhaps it is time to make a stand, even if the cause seems small to others." "I don't feel small to me," Margaret said quietly. "This isn't just about saving one woman from an unwanted fate. It's about whether people have the right to choose their own destiny, whether might makes right, whether there's any justice left in this world." "Heavy thoughts for someone who was a respectable frontier wife just days ago," Daniel observed. "That woman is dead," Margaret replied with more certainty than she'd felt before. "Whatever happens tomorrow, she can never come back. The question is, what will replace her?" Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire's glowing embers. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of emotion he rarely allowed to surface. "When I saw you in that saloon standing before those men like a deer surrounded by wolves, I saw something I thought was lost forever. Dignity in the face of defeat, courage when courage seemed pointless." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "My wife had that same quality. She faced death itself with her head held high." "I'm not your wife?" Margaret said softly, though without rejection in her voice. "No," Daniel agreed. "You are something else entirely, something I do not yet have words for." The conversation that followed was unlike any Margaret had ever experienced. Two people from vastly different worlds speaking honestly about fear and hope and the strange bonds that could form between strangers facing impossible odds together. They talked until the fire burned to ash and the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of dawn. Margaret realized she had found something precious in this wild place among these embattled people, not just safety or acceptance, but understanding. Daniel saw her not as a problem to be solved or a prize to be won, but as a person struggling to become something better than circumstances had forced her to be. As the camp began to stir around them, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Whatever the day brought, whatever price she might have to pay, she was no longer the broken woman who'd stood in Morrison's saloon. She had found her fire again, and she was ready to use it. The final battle for her freedom was about to begin. The sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when the scouts returned with grim news. The pursuing riders had made better time than expected and would reach the valley by midday. 23 men in total, heavily armed and led by someone the scouts described as a man who reads the earth like printed words. Margaret felt her stomach clench as Daniel relayed the information to the hastily assembled war council. 23 against 15 with the advantage of surprise, their only edge. The odds were brutal but not impossible if everything went according to plan. The tracker is the key. Broken Hawk observed his hostility toward Margaret, temporarily set aside in favor of tactical necessity. If he suspects deception, if he reads signs we do not expect, the trap fails before it begins. Then we give him signs that tell the story we want told, Margaret replied, surprising herself with her steadiness. Signs of a woman fleeing in panic, maybe. Signs of pursuit and capture that lead them exactly where we want them to go. Daniel nodded approvingly. Where would be the best place for such a capture to occur? Swift Eagle, one of the younger warriors, spoke up from his position near the lodge entrance. The narrow canyon 2 miles south where the old trail crosses the creek. Good cover for our men, only one way out for theirs, if they follow the false trail. Margaret knew the place they'd passed through it yesterday during her orientation tour of the surrounding country. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, creating a natural bottleneck that could become a deadly trap for anyone caught within it. How do we get them there without making it obvious? Morning Dove asked practically. I lead them there, Margaret said quietly. I run, they follow. Simple as that. Too simple, Owl Singing interjected sharply. Men like these do not hunt alone. They will send scouts ahead, watchers to the sides. If they see armed warriors waiting in ambush, they will not follow you into the canyon. Margaret felt a chill of realization. The plan required not just her performance as fleeing victim, but absolute invisibility from the Comanche warriors until the moment of attack. One glimpse of an armed man in the wrong place, one glint of sunlight off a blade or gun barrel, and the entire deception would collapse. Then we do it differently, Daniel said slowly, his tactical mind working through alternatives. We let them find the camp. We let them think they have won completely. What do you mean? Yellowbird asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to understand. We stage a capture here in full view, make it look like they surprised us before we could organize resistance. Some of our people flee in apparent panic, others surrender. They take their prize and leave thinking themselves victorious. Margaret saw the terrible elegance of the revised plan. It would require the entire band to act their parts perfectly, to appear defeated while actually positioning themselves for counterattack. More dangerous than her original proposal, but potentially more convincing to suspicious pursuers. And then, Broken Hawk asked, then we follow them. Wait until they make camp, until they relax their guard. Attack at dawn when their night watch is tired and their fires have burned low. Daniel's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who'd planned such raids before. It means a night of captivity for Margaret, Morning Dove pointed out quietly. A night alone with men who see her as property they have purchased. Much can happen in a night. The implications hung heavy in the air. Margaret would have to endure whatever treatment her captors deemed appropriate, trusting that rescue would come before permanent damage was done. It was asking her to gamble not just her life, but her dignity, her sanity, her very sense of self. I understand the risks, Margaret said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. I accept them. Do you? Daniel asked, his dark eyes boring into hers. Do you truly understand what these men are capable of? What they will do to a woman they believe they own? Margaret met his gaze steadily, drawing strength from the small horse carving hidden in her palm. I lived with those possibilities for months in Bitter Creek. At least this way, I'm choosing to face them instead of having them forced on me. Little Wolf had been listening from his position near the fire, his young face grave with understanding beyond his years. Now he spoke up, his voice clear and determined. I will go with the fleeing group, he announced. If the white men see me running away, they will believe the defeat is real. Children do not stay to watch their parents captured. No, Daniel said immediately. You stay with me. If something goes wrong, if the plan fails, I need to know you are safe. If the plan fails, nowhere will be safe, Little Wolf replied with devastating logic. But if I run with the women and elders, I can help watch for the signal to return. I can help with the attack when it comes. Margaret saw the conflict in Daniel's face, the father's need to protect warring with the warrior's recognition that his son's logic was sound. In this harsh world, even children had to be soldiers when necessity demanded it. He goes with Owl Singing's group, Daniel decided finally. But he stays back when the fighting starts. I will not have him in the front lines. The next few hours passed in a blur of desperate preparation, Personal belongings were hidden or buried, weapons were distributed and concealed, and everyone rehearsed their roles in the coming deception. Margaret found herself at the center of it all, the focal point around which the entire elaborate ruse would revolve. Yellowbird helped her prepare, adjusting her appearance to suggest someone who'd been roused from sleep and captured without time to properly dress. Her hair was deliberately mussed, her buckskin tunic slightly torn, her face smudged with dirt to suggest struggle and fear. Remember, owl singing coached her as the sound of approaching horses grew audible in the distance. You are defeated but not broken, frightened but not hysterical. They must believe you have accepted your fate while still hoping for mercy. Margaret nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure it must be visible through her clothing. Everything depended on her performance in the next few minutes, not just her own survival, but the lives of everyone in the band. The riders appeared at the valley's edge, like harbingers of doom, their dust cloud visible long before individual figures could be distinguished. Margaret counted them as they descended the slope, 23 men, as the scouts had reported, well armed and moving with the confidence of those who expected easy victory. At their head rode a figure that made Margaret's blood run cold. Not Morrison, as she'd expected, but Ezra Blackwood himself, his black coat making him look like a preacher come to conduct a funeral service. Beside him rode a weather-beaten man in buckskins, who could only be the tracker, someone whose skills had allowed them to follow trails that should have been impossible to read. Places everyone, Daniel murmured, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the scattered warriors. Remember, we are surprised, overwhelmed, defeated. Make it convincing. Margaret took her position near the central fire, forcing herself to appear as though she'd been caught in the middle of mundane morning tasks. Around the camp, other band members assumed their roles, some fleeing in apparent panic, others frozen in place with fear, a few making token gestures of resistance before being overwhelmed. The riders thundered into the camp like an avalanche, their horses' hooves churning up dust and ash from the morning fires. Blackwood's pale eyes fixed on Margaret immediately, and his smile was cold as winter wind. "Well, well," he called out, dismounting with theatrical flourish. "The prodigal daughter returns to her proper place. She's not going anywhere with you," Daniel said, stepping forward with carefully calculated defiance. He had to appear brave but outmatched, determined but ultimately helpless against superior numbers. "Ah, the noble savage speaks," Blackwood replied with mock courtesy. "How refreshing to find one with such command of English. Tell me, heathen, by what right do you claim property that belongs to civilized men?" "By the right of payment made and accepted," Daniel replied steadily. "I have harmed no one, stolen nothing. The woman came willingly." "Willingly." Morrison's voice cut through the morning air as he urged his horse closer to where Margaret stood. "Lady, you look mighty rough for someone who came willingly. These savages been treating you proper?" Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze, reading the calculated cruelty there. He was giving her a chance to denounce her captors, to claim abuse that would justify whatever violence he had planned. The temptation was enormous. One word from her could end this charade, could spare the band the risks of their desperate plan. "They have treated me well," she said quietly, the words coming out steadier than she dared hope. "Have they now?" Blackwood's smile grew wider, more predatory. "How interesting. Stockholm Syndrome, perhaps? Or has the degradation been so complete that you no longer remember what civilized treatment feels like?" The psychological warfare was expertly applied, designed to undermine her confidence and make her doubt her own perceptions. Margaret felt anger flare in her chest, not the helpless rage of the trapped, but the clean fire of someone who finally understood what she was fighting against. "I remember exactly what civilized treatment feels like," she replied with quiet dignity. "That's why I'm here instead of there." Several of the riders shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, perhaps recognizing the truth in her words. But Blackwood's expression never wavered, his certainty absolute and unshakable. Enough philosophical debate, he announced. Margaret Sullivan, by the authority vested in me by the territorial government and the debt obligations you have inherited, I hereby place you under protective custody. You will return with us to Bitter Creek, where proper arrangements will be made for your welfare. And if I refuse, Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Then you will be compelled, Blackwood replied simply. By force, if necessary. The choice is yours, Mrs. Sullivan, but the outcome is not. This was the moment of truth, the point where the deception would either succeed or fail catastrophically. Margaret looked around the camp, taking in the faces of people who'd shown her more genuine kindness in 3 days than her own community had managed in 3 years. Some were visible playing their assigned roles as defeated prisoners. Others had melted away into the rocks and trees, preparing for the counterattack that might never come if she failed now. Very well, she said, letting defeat color her voice. I'll come with you. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but they had the desired effect. Several of Blackwood's men relaxed visibly, their tension easing now that the prize had been claimed without bloodshed. Even the tracker seemed satisfied, his weathered face showing the calm confidence of someone whose job was complete. Wise choice, Morrison said with obvious satisfaction. Don't worry, lady. Once we get you back to proper society, you'll forget all about this savage nonsense. Few weeks of decent food and Christian company, you'll be right as rain. Margaret nodded submissively while internally cataloging the positions of various riders, noting which ones seemed most alert, which might pose the greatest threat when the inevitable conflict came. The performance had to be complete, convincing down to the smallest detail. What about them? One of the riders asked, gesturing toward the visible band members. Can't just leave hostile Indians behind us. They're hardly hostile, Blackwood replied dismissively. Look at them, a few warriors, some women and children, old people. Hardly a threat to anyone. Let them lick their wounds and remember what happens to those who interfere with lawful business. Margaret felt a surge of hope. The dismissal was exactly what they'd hoped for, Blackwood's arrogance working in their favor. He saw the Comanche as defeated and demoralized, no longer worth his attention or concern. Mount up, Blackwood ordered. I want to be well away from here before these people remember they have more warriors out hunting. The assumption was logical but wrong. The missing warriors were already in position, shadowing the group's anticipated route, but Blackwood couldn't know that could only work with the information his prejudices allowed him to see. Margaret was boosted onto a spare horse, her hands tied loosely to the saddle horn, in a gesture more symbolic than practical. The bonds were tight enough to look convincing, but not so restrictive that she couldn't eventually work free. Another small advantage that might prove crucial in the hours to come. As the cavalcade prepared to leave, Margaret caught Daniel's eye one final time. He stood among the other defeated prisoners, his face a mask of stoic resignation, but his dark eyes burned with promise. She would not be abandoned, would not be forgotten. Whatever the cost, rescue would come. Move out, Blackwood commanded, and the group began its journey south toward the canyon, where death waited with infinite patience. The first few miles passed uneventfully, the riders relaxed and confident in their victory. Margaret endured the crude jokes and speculative comments about her future with apparent resignation, all while memorizing landmarks and calculating distances. When the attack came, every second would matter. The tracker rode point, his experienced eyes reading the landscape with professional skill, but he was looking for signs of pursuit or ambush from behind, not recognizing that the greatest danger lay ahead in the form of warriors who'd had hours to prepare their positions. Tell me, Mrs. Sullivan, Blackwood said, urging his horse closer to hers as they descended into a wooded valley. What exactly did you think you were accomplishing with this little adventure? Did you imagine you could become some kind of noble savage yourself, live happily ever after in a teepee? I thought I could be free, Margaret replied honestly. I thought I could choose my own fate instead of having it chosen for me. Freedom. Blackwood mused as if the word were foreign to his tongue. An interesting concept, but freedom without structure, without proper guidance, becomes mere chaos. What you call freedom, civilized people call anarchy. And what you call civilization, I call slavery with better table manners. Margaret shot back her temper, finally overriding her caution. Blackwood's pale eyes glittered with something approaching amusement. Ah, there's the spirit we saw in Morrison's saloon. I wondered if the savages had managed to break it completely. Nothing's broken that can't be fixed, Margaret replied, and realized as she said it that the words carried more truth than she'd intended. She wasn't broken, battered, certainly tested beyond her limits, but not broken. The fire little wolf had seen in her eyes was still burning, perhaps brighter than ever. The canyon approached like the mouth of some great beast, its narrow walls rising steeply on both sides. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as they entered the confined space where 23 men would soon face the consequences of their arrogance and cruelty. But the attack didn't come. They passed through the canyon without incident, emerging onto the open plain beyond where camp would eventually be made. Margaret's heart sank as she realized the original plan had been abandoned, too risky perhaps, or simply unsuitable to changed circumstances. She would have to endure the night after all, would have to survive whatever treatment her captors deemed appropriate until rescue could be arranged. The thought filled her with dread, but also with a strange kind of resolve. She had chosen this path, had accepted these risks. Now she would see where they led. As evening approached, Blackwood called a halt in a sheltered grove beside a small stream. The location was tactically sound, good, water-adequate grazing for the horses, clear fields of fire in all directions. But it was also isolated, far from any possible witnesses to whatever might transpire during the long hours before dawn. "Make camp," Blackwood ordered. "Set watches, but don't get too comfortable. We ride hard tomorrow, and I want to be in Bitter Creek before the week is out." Margaret was hauled down from her horse and secured to a large oak tree with rope that was definitely not symbolic. The bonds were tight enough to prevent escape, but positioned to allow for sitting and limited movement. Clearly her captors intended her to survive the night, though in what condition remained to be seen. "Hungry?" Morrison asked, squatting beside her with a plate of beans and hardtack. "Got to keep our prize healthy after all." Margaret accepted the food without comment, eating mechanically, while her mind raced through possibilities. Where were Daniel and the others? Were they watching even now, waiting for the right moment to strike? Or had something gone wrong, some unforeseen complication that had forced them to abandon the rescue attempt? As full darkness settled over the camp, Margaret's situation became increasingly precarious. Several of the men had been drinking from flasks they'd carried in their saddlebags, and their comments about her were becoming more explicit, more threatening. Blackwood maintained discipline for now, but she could see his control beginning to fray as the alcohol did its work. "Pretty thing, ain't she?" one of the younger riders observed, his words slightly slurred. "Shame to see her wasted on savages when decent white men could put her to proper use." "All in good time, Collins," Blackwood replied smoothly. "But remember, damaged goods bring lower prices. We want her presentable when we return to town." The casual discussion of her market value made Margaret's skin crawl, but she forced herself to remain still, to give no sign of the rage building within her. Anger would be useful when the time came, but now it would only bring unnecessary pain. The hours crawled by. With agonizing slowness, Margaret dozed fitfully against the tree, starting awake at every sound that might herald rescue or signal fresh torment. The camp settled into the quiet routine of men on the trail. Guards changed fires, banked horses, tended. Normal sounds that should have been comforting but felt ominous given her circumstances. It was nearly midnight when Morrison approached her again, his steps unsteady with drink. Behind him came two other men, their faces flushed with alcohol and something darker. "Been thinking, Blackwood," Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Maybe we should sample the merchandise, make sure we're getting full value for our investment." "I said no," Blackwood replied firmly, though Margaret could hear irritation creeping into his voice. "She goes back intact, or the deal's off." "Deal's already made," Morrison argued, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. "Money's been paid, debts settled. What we do with our property is our business." Margaret felt terror crawl up her spine like a living thing. This was the moment she dreaded, the point where civilized pretense would be abandoned in favor of raw appetite. She tested her bonds desperately, but the knots were too tight, too well tied. "Please," she whispered, hating herself for begging but seeing no alternative. "Please don't do this." "Nothing personal, lady," Morrison said with mock sympathy. "Just business. Man's got needs, and you're here to meet them." He reached for her, his whiskey-stained breath hot against her face, his hands rough and demanding. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to disappear inside herself, tried to go somewhere safe until the horror was over. That's when the war cry split the night like a thunderbolt. The attack came from all sides, but once invisible warriors, suddenly materializing from shadows and striking with the fury of avenging angels. Margaret saw Morrison go down with an arrow in his chest, his scream cut short by the blade that opened his throat. Around the camp, similar scenes of swift justice played out as the Comanche warriors reclaimed what had been stolen from them. "Margaret," Daniel's voice cut through the chaos as he fought his way toward her, his knife work efficient and deadly. "Stay down, keep your head low." Margaret pressed herself against the tree, watching in fascination and horror as the night exploded into violence. The attackers moved like ghosts, striking without warning and fading back into darkness before their targets could respond. It was warfare as art form, brutal and beautiful in its deadly precision. Blackwood was shouting orders, trying to rally his scattered men, but confusion and darkness made coordinated response impossible. Several of his riders managed to reach their weapons, but they were shooting at shadows, while their enemies struck from the night itself. "Where are they?" someone screamed. "Where the hell are they coming from?" "Everywhere," came the panicked reply. "They're coming from everywhere." Margaret felt the ropes around her wrists part as Daniel reached her position, his blade making quick work of her bonds. She rubbed feeling back into her hands while the battle raged around them, grateful beyond words for the rescue that had come just in time. "Can you ride?" Daniel asked urgently, helping her to her feet. "Yes," Margaret replied, though her legs felt like water. "I can ride." "Good. The horses are—" His words were cut off as Blackwood appeared out of the darkness, his pistol aimed directly at Margaret's heart. The man's face was a mask of cold fury, his civilized veneer finally stripped away to reveal the savage beneath. "How touching," he snarled. "The noble savage comes to rescue his whore. Too bad he's too late." The gun roared in the confined space, its muzzle flash lighting up the night like lightning. Margaret felt the bullet pass close enough to burn her cheek, saw Daniel dive sideways with fluid grace, but Blackwood was already cocking the hammer for a second shot, his pale eyes glittering with murderous intent. That's when Little Wolf materialized beside them, moving with the silent speed his name suggested. The boy's knife took Blackwood in the side, sliding between ribs to find his heart. The preacher's eyes went wide with shock and pain, his gun dropping from nerveless fingers as he crumpled to the ground. "I told you to stay back," Daniel said, though his voice carried pride along with reproof. "You needed help," Little Wolf replied simply, wiping his blade clean with practiced efficiency. "A warrior helps his family." Family. The word hit Margaret like a physical blow, carrying implications that went far beyond mere friendship or obligation. She looked at this grave child who'd just killed to protect her, at the man who'd risked everything to keep her safe, and realized she'd found something she'd never expected to discover in this harsh wilderness. She'd found home. The battle was winding down now, the superior numbers and firepower of the attackers proving useless against superior tactics and motivation. Most of Blackwood's men were dead or wounded, the survivors scattering into the darkness to nurse their injuries and their shattered confidence. "It's over," Daniel announced, surveying the carnage with professional satisfaction. "They won't be troubling us again." Margaret looked around at the bodies scattered throughout the camp. Morrison with his throat cut, Blackwood with Little Wolf's knife in his heart, a dozen others who'd paid the ultimate price for their arrogance and cruelty. She should have felt horror, should have been sickened by the violence. Instead, she felt only a deep satisfaction that justice had finally been served. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we go home." Daniel replied, his arms settling around her shoulders with gentle possessiveness. "We go home and begin the rest of our lives." As they rode through the pre-dawn darkness toward the distant glow of their camp's fires, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd been sold like trash, in a frontier saloon, rescued by a stranger who'd seen something worth saving tested by fire and emerged stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. The woman who'd stood terrified in Morrison's saloon was truly dead now, buried beneath the weight of experience and transformation. What had risen in her place was something new, something forged in the crucible of necessity and tempered by the fierce heat of genuine love. Margaret Sullivan had finally found her fire, and she was ready to let it burn bright for whatever challenges lay ahead. She was no longer trash to be discarded or property to be owned. She was free, and she was home, and she was loved. The transformation was complete.